Can I sleep here? She didn't expect my answer. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the desolate landscape of the alien planet. The wind blew softly, rustling the dry leaves of twisted trees that stood as silent witnesses to the planet's forgotten history. Amidst the barren land, a lone figure moved, his steps heavy with the weight of defeat. The protagonist, a war veteran, trudged through the dusty terrain, his boots kicking up little clouds of dirt with each step. He had been stranded here after a failed mission. His ship was destroyed in the battle with an unknown faction, and he had been forced to flee, landing on this remote planet without any communication or backup. His mind raced with thoughts of his mission, the soldiers he had lost, and the endless fight that seemed to follow him everywhere. There was no escape from the horrors of war, no matter how far you traveled. As he walked, he stumbled upon the ruins of an ancient city, its crumbling stone structures half buried in the sand. The place looked as if it had been abandoned for centuries, but there was an eerie stillness about it. It felt like the ghosts of a long-forgotten civilization still lingered in the air, watching him, judging him. The silence was almost too much to bear, so he ventured deeper into the ruins, seeking shelter for the night. The city was eerily quiet, save for the occasional screech of distant creatures. The protagonist moved cautiously, checking his surroundings, alert for any signs of danger. As a seasoned soldier, he knew better than to trust a place like this. But with nowhere else to go, he had no choice but to make do with what he had. He found an old stone building, its walls cracked and worn by time. The roof had collapsed in some places, but there was enough space inside for him to rest. He set down his gear, taking a moment to gather his thoughts. The silence in the room was oppressive, making him feel even more isolated than he already was. He had no idea how long he would have to wait for rescue or if help would even come at all. As he sat there trying to calm his thoughts, he heard a soft sound from outside. It was faint, but it was enough to make him pause. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he reached for his weapon, instinctively preparing for whatever might come. But when he looked out the doorway, he saw something that caught him off guard. A figure emerged from the shadows, walking toward the building. It was a woman, her movements graceful and deliberate. She was dressed in dark, worn clothing that blended with the environment, her face obscured by a hood. She moved as if she knew exactly where she was going, as if this place was familiar to her. The protagonist's hand tightened around his weapon, unsure of whether she was friend or foe. His instincts screamed at him to be cautious. He had seen enough to know that nothing in this galaxy was ever as it seemed. But the woman didn't seem threatening, at least not at first. She stopped just outside the building, her gaze sweeping over the ruins as if searching for something. Her eyes, though hard to see, seemed to hold a certain depth, as if they had witnessed the same horrors he had. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and the protagonist felt a strange connection, a silent understanding between two people who had been through things most others couldn't imagine. Without a word, the woman took a few steps closer and spoke softly, her voice carrying a hint of uncertainty. "Can I sleep here?" The question hung in the air, startling the protagonist. It wasn't the usual approach one would expect from a stranger in such a harsh, isolated place. Her tone was calm, yet there was a vulnerability in it, as if she had no other choice but to ask. She didn't demand or plead, she simply asked, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The protagonist stood frozen, caught off guard by the simplicity of the question. He had been alone for so long that the idea of sharing a space with someone else felt strange, almost unnatural. Yet he found himself hesitating, unsure of how to respond. Trust was a fragile thing in this world, especially when one didn't know the intentions of the person standing before them. His hand slowly loosened its grip on his weapon. "You're welcome to stay," he said after a long pause. His voice was rough, a result of days without proper rest or conversation. He didn't know why he had agreed. Perhaps it was the loneliness, the need for some kind of connection, or maybe he saw something in her that made him trust her, if only for a moment. The woman nodded, a small sigh escaping her lips as she stepped inside the building. She didn't make any sudden moves, respecting the space between them. She seemed to understand the unspoken rules of survival in a world like this. They didn't need to share their histories, their pains, or their reasons for being here. For now, they were two souls in a vast, empty world, both seeking refuge from a storm neither could escape. The protagonist sat back against the stone wall, his thoughts still racing. He wondered who she was and what brought her to this desolate place. But for the time being, it didn't matter. They were both trapped here, whether by choice or by fate. As the darkness settled in, the two of them shared a quiet moment, each lost in their own thoughts. The only sound was the occasional rustle of wind outside and the distant howl of creatures that roamed the planet's wilds. The protagonist glanced at the woman, who had made herself comfortable against the far wall. She was still, her eyes closed, as if listening for something beyond the silence. He couldn't help but wonder if she, too, felt the weight of isolation. In the end, it didn't matter. They were both survivors, and for now, that was enough. But little did the protagonist know, this chance encounter would lead him into a journey he never expected, one that would change the course of his life forever. The night passed slowly, with only the sound of the wind and the occasional distant cry of an unknown creature breaking. The silence. The protagonist sat with his back against the cold stone wall, his eyes staring at the dim stars visible through the cracks in the roof. He didn't sleep much. His mind was restless, thinking about the mission that had brought him here, the wreckage of his ship, and the years of battles that seemed to follow him wherever he went. The woman hadn't said much after asking if she could stay. She had settled in a corner of the ruin, wrapping herself in a tattered cloak she pulled from her bag. Her body language was guarded, yet there was something about her calmness that made him feel a little less alone in this harsh place. Still, the silence between them felt thick, and neither one of them dared to break it. The next morning, the sun rose lazily over the horizon, casting a faint light on the ruined city. The protagonist stood up stiffly, stretching his muscles, and grabbed his gear. He wasn't sure how long they'd stay in this spot, but he knew he needed to find a way off this planet, one way or another. The woman stirred in her corner, her eyes fluttering open. She looked at him for a moment, as if unsure of what to do next. Finally, she stood up and spoke, her voice soft but steady. "I don't mean to intrude, but I can't stay here long," she said, her gaze steady on him. The protagonist raised an eyebrow. "Where are you planning to go?" Her face tightened for a moment, and then she let out a small sigh. "I'm looking for a place, somewhere safe. My people are in danger. I've been running for a long time." The words hung in the air between them. The protagonist, though initially reluctant to ask, found himself asking, "From who?" The woman hesitated, her eyes flickering with a hint of fear. "From a faction, a powerful group that's been hunting my people. We've been scattered, forced to live in the shadows, always moving, always hiding. I thought I could make it alone, but—" Her voice trailed off. The protagonist understood more than she knew. He had seen war, betrayal, and loss. He had fought in battles where survival meant doing whatever it took, even if it meant leaving people behind. But something in her eyes told him that her story was different. There was a sadness there, one that mirrored his own. For a moment they both stood in silence, each caught in their own thoughts. Finally, the protagonist broke the quiet. "You're not alone anymore," he said, surprising himself. "If you're still fighting, then we're in this together." The woman blinked, clearly taken aback by his words. She had probably expected a soldier to be just as guarded as she was, not someone willing to help a stranger without asking for anything in return. Her expression softened just a little, but enough for the protagonist to notice. "I didn't think anyone would offer help," she said quietly. "You don't even know me." He gave her a grim smile. "Sometimes we don't need to know each other, we just need to survive." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment he wondered what she was thinking. But then she nodded as if making up her mind. "You're right," she said. "Survival is what matters now. I'm not asking for much, just a place to rest, a safe path to follow." The protagonist nodded, turning toward the open entrance. The wind had picked up, and he knew they couldn't stay here much longer. "I know a place," he said. "It's not far, we'll need to move fast." They gathered their things, preparing for the next step in their journey. As they left the ruins behind, the woman followed close behind, her footsteps light but determined. The protagonist kept his eyes on the horizon, scanning the landscape for any signs of danger. He didn't trust this planet, didn't trust the people who might be watching from the shadows. They walked in silence for a while, moving swiftly across the rocky terrain. The woman was quiet, but the tension between them had eased. She didn't seem like a threat, but he couldn't forget that they were both strangers to each other. Trust had to be earned, not given. The day passed slowly, the sun climbing higher in the sky, but the heat was bearable. They moved along the edge of a crumbled stone canyon, the walls rising steeply on either side, offering them some cover from prying eyes. The protagonist stayed alert, his hand resting on the handle of his weapon, ready for anything. Around midday, they stopped to take a break. The woman pulled out a small packet of food and offered it to him. He hesitated for a moment but then accepted, realizing he hadn't eaten much in the past few days. They ate in silence, the only sound the soft crunch of their food and the occasional whisper of the wind. "So, what's your name?" she asked suddenly, breaking the silence. The question caught him off guard. It had been a long time since he had introduced himself to anyone. He didn't normally share personal details, especially not with strangers, but something about the way she asked made him pause. "Call me Kane," he said after a moment, his voice quiet. It wasn't his real name, but it was close enough. She nodded as if accepting his answer. "Kane," she repeated. "I'm Eris." The way she said it made it sound like there was more to the name than just a simple introduction. But Kane didn't press her. She wasn't ready to share everything about herself, just as he wasn't ready to share everything about his past. For now, that was enough. They packed up their things and continued on, moving cautiously through the rocky landscape. The sun was beginning to dip low in the sky when they finally reached their destination, a hidden cave tucked away in the side of a cliff. The entrance was small, barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look. Kane led the way, checking the area for any signs of trouble before allowing Eris to enter. Inside, the cave was cool and dark, a welcome change from the heat of the outside world. It wasn't much, but it would serve as a temporary shelter. Kane set down his gear and began to organize their supplies while Eris looked around, her eyes scanning the walls. "This will do for now," she said, her voice quiet but appreciative. Kane nodded, though he was still thinking about their next move. He didn't trust anyone completely, especially not after everything he had seen in his years of fighting. But something about Eris told him that she wasn't like the others he had crossed paths with. She was a survivor just like him. Maybe, together, they could find a way to stop the war that had consumed both their lives. For now, though, all they could do was rest. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and they would face them together, whatever it took. The days passed quickly as Kane and Eris moved through the harsh landscape, always on the lookout for any signs of danger. They had grown accustomed to the silence between them, the unsaid words that hung in the air. They didn't need to speak much. Their actions told the story of two people simply trying to survive. As they continued on their journey, Kane found himself becoming more aware of Eris. She wasn't just another survivor, she was resourceful and strong. Her movements were always careful, yet confident, as if she had been trained for this kind of life. She never complained about the hardships they faced, and Kane admired that about her. She reminded him of himself at a younger age, when he was more willing to fight for survival without questioning the world around him. One morning, they reached the edge of a thick forest, the trees standing tall and dense. Kane paused for a moment, scanning the area. The wind had picked up and the air felt colder. There was something about this place that made him uneasy, but he couldn't place it. Eris was already a few steps ahead, moving through the trees with ease. "We'll camp here tonight," Kane said, his voice steady. He didn't want to take any chances. The forest might offer some shelter, but it also held dangers they couldn't see yet. Eris glanced back at him, her expression unreadable. "Are you sure?" Kane nodded. "We need to rest. It'll be a good place to hide for the night." Eris didn't argue. She simply turned back to the forest and continued walking. Kane followed, though his senses were on high alert. They reached a small clearing in the woods and set up camp quickly, each of them working silently, used to the routine by now. As the evening approached, the temperature dropped and the forest grew darker. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of distant animals. They sat close to the small fire they had made, the crackling flames casting flickering shadows on the trees. "I've been thinking," Eris said suddenly, breaking the quiet. Kane looked up, his expression neutral. "About what?" "About why you're helping me," she replied. Her voice was soft but curious. "You could have left me behind after we met. There was nothing stopping you." Kane didn't answer right away. He stared into the fire, the flickering flames dancing in his eyes. It was a question he had asked himself many times since their first encounter. Why had he agreed to help her? What made her different from all the other people he had crossed paths with over the years? "I don't know," he said finally, his voice low. "Maybe I saw something in you, maybe I saw something in myself." Eris was quiet for a moment, considering his words. She then nodded as if accepting his answer. I understand, but I still don't know what your real plan is. What are you after, Kane? Kane looked at her, meeting her gaze. There was no fear in her eyes, only curiosity and a hint of suspicion. She was right to ask. He had been keeping his own secrets, but he couldn't keep hiding from her forever. I told you, he said, his tone firm. I'm after the faction that's been hunting people like you. I don't trust them, and I want to see them fall. Eris nodded again, but this time Kane noticed the tension in her shoulders. She was still thinking, still processing what he had said. And what do you expect from me? She asked. You're not doing this out of the kindness of your heart. You want something. Kane hesitated. She was right again. There was always a price to pay in a world like this. I want information. I want to know where they're hiding, who they're working with. I need to destroy them from the inside out, and I need your help to do it. Eris seemed to consider his words carefully. Then with a slight nod, she spoke. I'll help you, but don't think for a second that I'm doing this for you. I'm doing this for my people. Kane didn't respond immediately. He knew she had her own reasons for fighting, her own personal stakes in this war. But for the first time in days, he felt like he wasn't alone in this fight. They both had something to lose, and together, maybe they could do what neither of them could do alone. The fire crackled between them, the only sound in the quiet forest. Kane leaned back against a tree, feeling the weight of their shared decision. He didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time since he had crash-landed on this planet, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. As the night grew darker, the wind picked up, howling through the trees. The forest seemed to close in around them, and Kane couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, but he pushed the thought aside. He couldn't afford to be distracted now. He glanced at Eris, who was sitting across from him, her eyes scanning the dark woods. She had become more than just a fellow survivor. She was someone he could rely on, someone who understood what it meant to fight for something bigger than herself. He didn't know where this path would lead, but he knew one thing for certain. Their journey was just beginning. The night passed slowly, both of them keeping watch, each lost in their thoughts. As dawn broke, the first light of day creeping through the trees, they packed up their things and prepared to move on. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but Kane felt a sense of resolve growing inside him. He wasn't alone anymore. And with Eris by his side, they might just have a chance to take down the faction that had caused so much pain and suffering. Together, they set off once more, disappearing into the dense forest, their footsteps fading into the distance as the world around them seemed to hold its breath. The morning light filtered through the thick forest canopy as Kane and Eris continued their journey, the silence. Between them, now more comfortable than it had been in the past. The trust they had slowly built over the last few days seemed to grow with each passing step. Neither spoke much, but their actions had become synchronized, a quiet understanding forming between them. As they walked, Kane couldn't help but notice how natural it felt to have someone by his side. He had spent so many years alone, a lone wolf, surviving by his wits and his strength. But now, for the first time, it felt like they were a team, each relying on the other to get through whatever challenges lay ahead. Their goal was still clear, to find and dismantle the faction that had been hunting Eris's people. But as they moved deeper into the forest, Kane began to wonder if the path they were taking would truly lead to the answers they sought, or if they were only digging themselves deeper into danger. The dense trees parted as they reached a small clearing. Kane held up his hand, signaling for Eris to stop. She followed his lead, her eyes scanning the area, her body still and alert. Something didn't feel right. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He wasn't sure what it was. Maybe it was the way the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across the ground, or the odd stillness in the air. Eris stepped closer to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "What is it?" Kane didn't answer immediately. His eyes narrowed as he looked around, trying to catch any movement in the distance. He had learned to trust his instincts over the years, and right now they were telling him that they weren't alone. "Stay close," he said quietly, reaching for his weapon. He didn't want to alarm her, but the tension was thick in the air. They both knew better than to let their guard down. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the trees on the far side of the clearing. Kane's hand tightened around his weapon, but he didn't draw it yet. The person was moving slowly, cautiously, as if testing the ground. Kane studied the figure, a tall, armored individual with a face obscured by a helmet. He didn't recognize the uniform, but the weight of the person's presence told him they weren't just a wanderer. They were someone with purpose, The figure stopped just outside the clearing, their eyes scanning the area as if they were searching for something or someone. Kane's heart raced. The air felt charged, the kind of tension that came before an inevitable confrontation. Eris took a step closer to Kane, her hand resting on the hilt of her own weapon. "Who is that?" she asked, her voice steady but low. "I don't know," Kane replied, his gaze locked on the figure, "but I don't think they're here to chat." Without warning, the figure spoke, their voice muffled but clear. "You've been running long enough, it's time to end this." Kane's eyes widened. The words sent a chill through him, but it was the tone that unsettled him the most. It wasn't a threat, it was a statement, as if they knew exactly what Kane and Eris were up to. "You're looking for us?" Kane said, his voice low but forceful. "What do you want?" The figure didn't move, but they tilted their heads slightly, as if considering the question. After a long pause, they spoke again. "We're not your enemy, but you're interfering with something bigger than you understand." Eris stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about? Who are you?" The figure didn't immediately answer. Instead, they took a few steps forward, the armor creaking slightly with each movement. "You're hunting the faction that's been chasing you, but there are others, forces much older, much more powerful than the faction you're after. They're the ones you need to fear." Kane's mind raced. The words were cryptic, but they didn't feel like a warning. It felt like an invitation to a deeper mystery, one that had been hidden beneath the surface for far too long. "What do you want from us?" Kane asked, his grip on his weapon tightening. The figure's eyes, hidden behind the helmet, seemed to glint with something like understanding. "We've been watching you. We know your mission, but you can't take down the faction alone. If you really want to end this, you'll need help." "Help that's been waiting for someone like you." Eris moved slightly, her posture still tense. "Help, we don't need anyone's help." The figure nodded, as if they had expected that answer. "Everyone needs help, whether they admit it or not. And if you continue on this path, you'll find out exactly how much help you need." Kane didn't like the sound of that. He didn't like the idea of being used or manipulated, but something in the figure's voice made him think twice. "Who are you?" he asked again, more forcefully this time. The figure didn't answer right away. Instead, they stepped closer, and Kane instinctively took a step back, keeping his distance. The figure reached up and removed their helmet, revealing a face that was both familiar and not. It was a face he had seen in the records, a face he had studied during his time with the military. It was someone from his past. Kane's heart skipped a beat. The person standing in front of him was a former ally, someone he had fought alongside years ago before everything had gone wrong. Their name was Daxton, a soldier who had disappeared after a mission had gone awry. Kane had thought he was dead, but now, standing before him, Daxton was very much alive. "Daxton?" Kane's voice was thick with disbelief. The man, Daxton, nodded, a faint smirk appearing on his face. "You look surprised to see me. Thought I was dead, didn't you?" Kane didn't know what to say. The world had a way of twisting things, of bringing the past crashing into the present in ways that made everything feel uncertain. "I don't understand," Kane said, his voice low and guarded. "Why are you here? Why now?" Daxton's expression turned serious. "Because you're in over your head, Kane, and I'm the only one who can help you get out of it." Eris, still on edge, looked from Kane to Daxton and back again. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice hard. Kane took a deep breath. "It seems like we're not the only ones after the faction, and this man," he gestured to Daxton, "knows more than he's telling." Daxton's eyes flickered, but he didn't deny it. "There's a bigger picture here, Kane. You and your friend are just small pieces in a much larger game." Kane's heart pounded in his chest as he processed the words. This wasn't just about survival anymore. There were forces at play that neither he nor Eris fully understood, forces that could change everything. Daxton's voice softened, though there was a hint of urgency in it now. "If you really want to win this, Kane, you'll need to listen. Trust me, I've been where you are, but this fight, it's bigger than anything we've faced before." Kane stood still for a moment, the weight of Daxton's words pressing on him. He didn't know if he could trust him, not after all these years. But the situation was clear. They needed help. And if Daxton was the only one who could provide it, they had no choice but to listen. "All right," Kane said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his mind. "Tell us what we need to do." Daxton smiled, a flash of something dark in his eyes. "I thought you'd see things my way." And just like that, Kane and Eris were caught in a web much larger than they had anticipated, with new alliances forming and old enemies resurfacing. The real battle was just beginning. The tension between Kane, Aris, and Daxton was thick, heavier than the air around them. Daxton's sudden reappearance had thrown them off balance, and neither Kane nor Aris knew what to make of him. Kane had trusted Daxton once, but that was years ago. The world had changed, and people changed with it. Still, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Daxton knew more than he was letting on. "We need to move," Daxton said, his voice cutting through the silence. "We're wasting time here, and if we don't act fast, we'll be sitting ducks." Kane hesitated, looking at Aris. She had remained quiet since Daxton revealed himself, her expression unreadable. She wasn't one to trust easily, especially after everything that had happened to her and her people. And Kane knew that, just like him, she had learned the hard way that trust was a dangerous thing. Aris finally spoke, her voice steady but sharp. "What do you want from us, Daxton? You've been hiding all these years, and now you just show up and expect us to believe that you're here to help." Daxton looked at her, his eyes cold and calculating. "I don't need you to believe anything, but if you want to survive, you'll listen. The faction you're after," he paused for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in, "it's not the real enemy." Kane narrowed his eyes, a cold pit forming in his stomach. "What do you mean?" Daxton stepped forward, lowering his voice so that only they could hear. "The faction is just a front. They're being controlled by something bigger, someone bigger. I've been tracking their movements for years, and I've seen the truth. There's a powerful organization pulling the strings, and they won't stop until they've wiped out everyone who stands in their way." Kane felt a chill run down his spine. "And you've been working with them all this time?" Daxton's eyes flashed with something dangerous. "No. I've been trying to stop them, but it's not easy. They're everywhere, and they have resources beyond anything you can imagine." Aris crossed her arms, her expression hard. "So why should we trust you now?" Daxton's gaze softened, though there was a certain edge to his words. "Because I'm your best chance. You can keep fighting the faction, but you'll never win if you don't take down the ones who are controlling them. I know their plans, I know their weaknesses, and if you're serious about stopping them, you'll need me." Kane glanced at Aris, trying to gauge her reaction. Her face was still a mask, but he could see the conflict in her eyes. She didn't want to trust Daxton. Neither did Kane, but they both knew that in a world like this, sometimes you had to make hard choices. The alternative was death. Finally, Aris spoke again, her voice quiet but resolute. "What do we do next?" Daxton nodded, seeming to appreciate her willingness to listen. "We move fast. There's a hidden base where the real power lies. If we can infiltrate it, we can take them down, but we have to be careful. The enemy is watching, and they'll do anything to protect their secrets." Kane didn't like the sound of it. The thought of infiltrating an enemy base was dangerous, maybe even suicidal. But what choice did they have? If what Daxton said was true, and there was something far more dangerous than the faction pulling the strings, they had to stop it. "All right," Kane said, his voice firm. "We'll do it your way. But if this turns out to be another one of your tricks, Daxton, I won't hesitate to end this right here." Daxton's gaze was steady, unwavering. "I don't need to prove myself to you, Kane, but I'll show you the truth. And if you're still not convinced after that, then you can go your own way." Kane didn't respond. He didn't need to. The decision had already been made. They had a plan, and they had no time to waste. Kane motioned for Aris to follow as he turned toward the path that Daxton had indicated. The journey ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. They couldn't afford to turn back now. As they moved through the dense forest, Daxton led the way, his pace steady and sure. Kane and Aris followed, each lost in their own thoughts. The forest around them seemed to grow darker with each step, the trees closing in as if the world itself were holding its breath. Kane couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. But there was no way to know for sure, not until they reached the base. The journey took several hours, the dense undergrowth slowing their progress. As they reached the edge of a cliff, Daxton held up his hand, signaling for them to stop. They were overlooking a sprawling complex hidden beneath the trees, its high walls and guard towers barely visible through the thick foliage. "This is it," Daxton whispered, his voice tight with urgency. "The base is heavily guarded. But we can get in through the maintenance tunnels. I've already scouted the area. We'll need to move quickly and stay low." Kane and Aris exchanged a glance. They had been through worse, but the thought of infiltrating a heavily guarded base was still daunting. Still, they had no choice. "Let's do it," Kane said, his voice steady. With that, they made their way down the cliffside, moving as silently as they could. The closer they got to the base, the more Kane's senses were on high alert. Every rustle in the bushes, every shift in the wind made him more tense. But Daxton was right. This was their chance to stop the real enemy, the one that had been pulling the strings all along. The maintenance tunnels were hidden beneath a small building at the back of the base, and as Daxton had promised, the security was light there. They slipped inside unnoticed, the tunnels dark and damp, with the sound of distant machinery humming in the background. Kane led the way, his heart pounding in his chest as he pushed forward, the weight of the mission heavy on his shoulders. They couldn't afford to fail, not now, not when they were so close. The tunnel opened into a large, dimly lit room. At the far end, Kane could make out a set of steel doors. Behind those doors was the control center, where the real power of the faction and the larger organization lay. The only thing standing between them and their goal was a few heavily armed guards. "We go in fast," Daxton murmured. "No hesitation. We take out the guards, get to the control room, and end this." Kane nodded. His grip on his weapon tightened as he signaled to Aris. Together they moved forward, swift and silent. The guards didn't know what hit them. Within minutes, they were down, the room silent once again. Daxton stepped forward, his fingers moving quickly over a control panel. The doors to the control room slid open, revealing a small group of high-ranking officers. The looks on their faces were a mixture of shock and fear as they realized they had been caught. "End of the line," Daxton said, his voice cold. "This is where it all stops." Kane stepped forward, his mind clear. There was no turning back now. This was the moment they had been working toward. They would either take down the enemy or die trying. The battle that followed was fast and brutal, but it was also decisive. Kane and Aris fought with everything they had, and in the end, they emerged victorious. The control room fell silent once more, but this time it was for good. They had done it. They had stopped the real enemy. As they stood amidst the wreckage, Kane felt something shift within him. The mission wasn't over. There would always be more to fight for. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had a purpose again, and he wasn't alone. Aris looked at him, her face serious but resolute. "We did it," she said, her voice steady. Kane nodded. "Yeah, we did, but there's still a lot left to do. And we're just getting started." The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. They were in this together, and together they would fight for whatever it took to win.